Hi, today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about moral relativism. So, to start with, I want to look at 20 different statements and how we might be inclined to justify them or explain why someone should listen to them. So, here I've got the first 10. So, the first one is we drive on the right side of the road. That might be something you teach your kids when they're growing up. You also teach them these other lessons that light in a vacuum travels that speed per second. That a meter is a length traveled by light in a vacuum over that period of a second. How many points a touchdown is worth? 6. Games the words football and soccer refer to, and of course, what you call football is going to depend on where you grow up. That the moon's gravity causes the Earth's tides. That electrons possess a positive charge. They of course possess a negative charge, but it doesn't matter that that's wrong. Smoking doesn't cause cancer. Kiss a person on each cheek to greet them, and the Earth is spherical. So what I want to do is sort these list of statements, whether they're true or false, right? Because electrons possessing a positive charge is false, but sort them into two categories. On the left, I have a category which I have named the reasons we are correct are ... And the point being is that is the sort of statement or lesson you can teach a kid, and then also give a justification for why it's correct, right? It is the sort of thing which, to accept it, you should have to prove and give good absolute reasons for why it's true. And then the right side, I have a different column. The justification for the lesson you teach is only, well, that's just what we do around here. It's tradition, right? There is no absolute justification for it. To the extent that you're teaching this to somebody as true is you're just teaching them what the customs and traditions, the way of life in your area is. So there is no absolute justification that goes beyond your culture, right? It just appeals to pure tradition and custom and habit. So if we sort these statements according to those two categories, we drive on the right side of the road. Why do we do that? I mean, all you can say is, well, that's just what we do around here. And you might tell this history of how it got to be that way, but you're not really justifying it. When you tell the history, you're really just explaining, well, how did it get to be what we do around here? The justification you offer is, it just is what we do around here. It's tradition. But the fact that light travels in a vacuum at this speed, I mean, that is something that it's not just, well, that just happens to be what we believe about light here, right? That's something that you are expected to, and we should demand of you to justify. And if some society or culture came up with a different answer, we would say, well, you can't just justify that you believe that light travels instantaneously, or that light travels at a slower speed. Like, you can't just say, well, that's just what we believe around here. That's our tradition about thinking about light. It is a absolute true or false matter, which is something that to believe and to accept that lesson, you should demand a full argument for that doesn't just appeal to social convention, that doesn't just appeal to culture. And I've sorted these other things out according to how you might sort these things. So for example, 7, electrons possess a positive charge. Like, that's something you couldn't say, well, that's just what we believe around here. There are reasons why that answer is correct or incorrect. So in that case, it's incorrect. So it's the sort of thing you have to be able to justify and give an argument for that doesn't just appeal to culture. And that's the sort of thing that when you try to give that argument, you should realize is wrong. And of course, smoking doesn't cause cancer. Like, if you went to another culture and they smoked and you said you really should quit because that causes cancer, and they say, no, it doesn't. That's not what we believe in my culture. And you say, like, well, it doesn't matter what you believe in your culture. That's not the sort of thing that is just left open to tradition and be settled that way. It's like there's a true answer here, one that we can give an argument for. You don't get to just accept whatever you want on that matter about whether smoking causes cancer, because the world doesn't care about what your culture says. There's an answer as to what's true or false. So some things are just matters of convention. They go on the right. Other things are matters of whether they line up with the truth of the world, and they go on the left side. And one of the big differences is for the cultural conventional things, the justification for them, why they're true, why you tell someone to listen to the lesson, is that you just appeal to that's what we do around here. Whereas the things which have a true answer that is not culturally relative are things that you should be able to give a not culturally relative argument for. Here's another set of things. Now, this list is actually going to be a little harder to sort, and this is the sort of list of things that actually a lot of people are tempted to put everything on the right side. And I want to push you to think, and that's what the cultural relativist, the moral relativist wants to do. They want to push everything here onto the right side. I want to push you to think that, no, we should sort this list, some on the left, some on the right, just like we did with the first list. So statement 11 is a period goes at the end of a sentence and two spaces go after a period. That should go on to presumably, it's just what we do around here. And if you're younger, you should know, two spaces after a period is not something we do anymore. The reason it used to be two spaces is how typewriters worked, and now it doesn't make sense to still do that on a computer. But like old people like me who are taught the two spaces rule, sometimes they stick to it even though it's silly to still do that on a computer. The reasoning is that typewriters couldn't make the spaces between letters any bigger or smaller. So a period took up the same amount of space as a letter. And so it made it hard to tell the difference between the end of a sentence and the next sentence if you didn't put two spaces. Computers automatically push the period closer to the end of the word and leave space on the right. So basically, computers are already factoring in that this is the two spaces thing, so that you only need to put one space to get the right amount of space after a period. So that's the reason why that rule changed. But, if someone wants to put two spaces because they're old, whatever, right? Like, it's just what we do around here. It signals their out of touchness, their failure to update their practices as culture changes, as technology changes. There's nothing really, I guess, wrong about putting two spaces after a period. And really, we could have stuck to that tradition anyway. Like, we could have all just said, you know what, even though computers adjust for it, we're going to stick to the old rule. And that'd be fine, because how many spaces we put after a period is just a traditional custom, convention, social matter. There's no correct answer as to how many spaces to put after a period. But then the next thing on my list, slavery is wrong. I mean, that's the sort of thing that if you go to another culture and they have enslaved some minority populace, and you say, like, how can you treat a fellow human being like that? Treat them like property, completely dismiss their autonomy, their choices, and discount their suffering, and elevate yourself and your well-being over theirs. And the person answers, well, that's just what we do around here. That's our tradition. That's not a good enough answer, right? That's the sort of thing that we want to say, no, if slavery is right, there better be goddamn good reasons for why you're having slavery. I mean, maybe you can say some sort of story. Listen, the world is ending. We're all going to die. We have to get some really difficult work done. The military is kind of like that. We're going to, with conscription, when you have a non-voluntary military, you say, we're all going to die unless we force a couple of us to fight and defend the country against their will. It's an emergency. That sort of explanation you might be able to give. And that's you're not saying it's just what we do around here. You're giving reasons why it's correct, which doesn't appeal to your culture, but appeals to broader abstract reasons that any member of any culture could understand, right? It's a absolute sort of justification rather than a relative sort of justification. It's wrong to kill people for personal gain. That's another sort of thing you might want to say is an absolute matter, whether it's right or wrong. It's wrong to eat dead people, and it's gross. Shake hands upon being introduced to someone. Show and treat others with respect. We should be tolerant of others. Adult incest is wrong. When you get older, you marry a member of the opposite sex and have kids. Men provide for the family, and women raise kids. So here's one way of sorting this list, although I'm a little sketchy about if I've sorted it right at the bottom. So the period at the end of the sentence, two spaces at the end of a sentence goes to you don't have to give an argument for. The only justification possible is tradition, social convention. Slavery is wrong. It's wrong to kill people for personal gain. That's the sort of thing you are right to demand an absolute non-cultural justification for, an argument for, just like we demand an argument for beliefs about the speed of light. It's wrong to eat dead people, and it's gross. That seems like that's just a social convention. There are cultures in the past who eat like that is the way you dispose of the body of a beloved family member. It's not the most healthy thing. Like there's a lot of diseases. The reasons why we find cannibalism gross is evolutionary, because unlike other meats that come from animals that we are not so, I mean, I can't easily pick up the diseases of a pig or a bird or a cow. It's very easy for me to get whatever diseases a fellow human has if I eat them. So there's reasons why the social convention exists. And you could give those reasons. They're not really moral reasons. They're more like it's a bad idea for your health to eat dead people, kind of like smoking. But you could have, I mean, there's nothing like morally wrong with it. If you want to say there's something morally reprehensible about eating somebody who's dead, that seems like that's just a tradition. That's what we do around here. If there were no health drawbacks, it doesn't seem there's no reason why a culture couldn't have and hasn't had, as they're respecting your elder when they die and caring about your family member, required you to eat them when they were dead instead of bury them, which again, there have been the Calicians, I think, were this ancient culture, which they ate their dead as a means of showing respect for their dead as opposed to burying them. Shake hands upon being introduced to someone. Other cultures bow. Some cultures kiss people on the cheek. Like that is just a social convention. There's no right answer as to the correct way of doing it. Again, you could say some sort of health reason why shaking hands is kind of a bad idea because you're trading germs. I mean, right now during the pandemic, we're kind of doing the elbow bump. I would love it if our culture got rid of shaking hands as the way to greet people, just because it trades germs in the way that it is a little problematic. But again, it's not really a moral matter. And how you greet someone seems to be just something like that's more of a tradition. Show and treat others with respect. I mean, we shake hands in order to show and treat others with respect. And you might think that there are good reasons why you should treat your fellow human persons with respect and not disrespect them and treat them like they are less than you, despite the fact they are an equal free will, just like you. We should be tolerant of others. I mean, this is an interesting one because the moral relativists, one of the sort of reasons people are drawn to moral relativism is this idea that it allows us to be more tolerant and not judge other cultures. But of course, then tolerance itself would be a relative matter. And if you belong to an intolerant culture, then being intolerant would be the correct thing for you to do if moral relativism was true. So, I mean, the only way you get some sort of absolute moral truth that being tolerant of others and not judging them and not imposing your way of life on them as being something morally required of us is if we are not moral relativists and we add that to our list of absolute moral truths. The last things I have on this list, so incest is obviously when it's a parent and a young child, that's just rape, and it's wrong in all the ways that pedophilia and rape is wrong. You can also imagine just cases where there's like a power dynamic involved in incest and like a parent who's pressuring their child or something. There's ways in which probably most cases of incest are morally wrong. But when you think about like adult consensual incest between like two 30-year-old gay men who aren't going to have kids, that seems like if we treat that as wrong, it's got to just be just our custom or tradition. The next two are also sort of customs and traditions. When you get older, you marry a member of the opposite sex and have kids. Men provide for the family and women raise. Those are sort of things that people attempt to justify by saying, well, that's just what we do around here. That's a matter of our culture. I think that these last two in particular are different from the earlier ones because we can give absolute moral reasons for why those practices are probably bad. Like they're disrespectful. Like those are the sorts of things that we can't give arguments for, and we do just justify by appeal to our tradition and what we do around here. But you might think that those traditions need to change because of the ways in which they disrespect or don't treat certain people in the society as equals. And so we might want to say, even though they are the sort of matter which is only justified by appeal to tradition and society and convention, those are conventions which themselves are morally wrong for absolutist reasons. That being said, it gets really difficult here, right? Because you have a lot of cases where there are men provide for the family and women raise the kids, and you might think that there's something wrong about enforcing that on people and having that as a part of the culture, even though it's the sort of thing that is only justified by tradition, and you might think that tradition is a bad one. But you have plenty of men and women who endorse that sort of way of life, and really, then I think there's nothing. I mean, there's no consent issues, so maybe that is. If you want to buy into that, I mean, I'm not so worried about the men buying into it, but if it's a woman who wants to follow tradition in that way, and say, well, that the reason I think that this is right and I live my life by it is that it's just my tradition and the way that I want to live the same way my grandparents lived, fine, right? The problems with these last ones are sort of more when those sorts of standards get enforced on people who don't want to follow tradition, and it seems like tradition is not anything on that right column that says it's just what we do around here is not the sort of thing you should be able to enforce on somebody who is unwilling. So whereas on the left side, there are reasons why we were correct. Slavery is wrong. Even if there's someone who wants to own slaves, too fucking bad, right? Like we should go and fight and liberate those slaves and kill those slave owners. There's good reason why that is not something that can be left open to justification merely by appeal to tradition and cultural convention. So there's a couple examples that are in the reading. So one is the Eskimos, or there's the Eskimo. I'm not exactly sure if Eskimos is the right terminology here, but of a certain culture that often would commit infanticide. And we talked a lot about infanticide and whether it's even from like a non-cultural justification, if it's morally permissible or not. And one way to think about this, sort of, when people found out about, people would go and visit this society, they'd find out about the infanticide, they'd come back and they'd write stories about it, and then people in the Western world, in like Europe, would just be horrified by the stories of this culture that practiced infanticide. What's interesting is when you ask them, like, well, why do you do it? They're going to tell you a story about, like, listen, times are tough. We live in a very harsh environment. We can't raise any child in this environment who has health problems. It's just they're going to die anyway because we can't care for them. We need the most health, you can tell that maybe it's not a good justification, but notice they're not saying infanticide is just what we do around here. They say infanticide, and then they give you an attempted justification that you're able to appreciate even from your different culture. If they had said, that's just what we do around here, that's not a justification that appeals to you or justifies it to you as a member of a different culture. So, we drive on the right side of the road. You talk to someone in a culture that drives on the left side. When I say, well, that's just what we do around here, that doesn't make them feel like they need to drive on the right side of the road because you drive. The infanticide thing. They're not just saying, they're not avoiding giving a justification. They're taking it as if there is a true answer, whether this is right or wrong, regardless of culture, and they're trying to justify to you as a non-member of their culture that this is actually justified and truly right or permissible, given their unique circumstances of their living, where their culture, where their society has to survive. Another sort of case, female genital mutilation. So female circumcision, which is not very similar to male circumcision. I mean, there's different grades of female circumcision, but like it's often, usually it involves completely eliminating the clitoris so that it makes the woman unable to experience sexual pleasure, right? So it's cutting out this important part of human life. It's done on children who can't make the decision for themselves. I mean, there's health problems too. There's infections. I mean, I don't know how common infections are. I don't know how common there's health problems. But I guess the worry here is that this practice is the sort of thing that they perform. I mean, why do cultures who have this tradition have this tradition. It's not like the Eskimos. It's not that they live in this harsh environment and and that they practice infanticide because it's a necessary requirement for the society to survive in the harsh environment they live in. This is something they would say, well, it's just our tradition, it's what we do around here. This sort of male-female relationship dynamic where we remove women's enjoyment of sex is like an important part of our culture is the sort of thing you want to say is like, well, that's not the sort of like the subjugation of these women, the depriving them of this pleasurable, the ability to have pleasure from sex and taking it away from them when they're a young child and it's not their choice is not something that can be justified in this sort of that's just what we do around here kind of way. You need to give us a good goddamn reason for why you're doing this. And unlike the Eskimos, there's nothing, right? There's nothing. If you ask them, like, why do you do this practice? What's the non-culturally relative justification for it? There's nothing for them to say. The Eskimos have maybe a bad explanation, but they can at least give you what the non-culturally relative one is. For this practice, you have to just say, well, that's just what we do around here. And this does not seem like the sort of thing that we should be comfortable being, justified in that sort of mere appeal to tradition. Okay, so I've got on my list here, I've sorted some of these moral things on the in between what seems like it's non-relative, what we require good arguments for, and the sort of things that are relative, and it's perfectly fine just to appeal to tradition. So the non-relative side, we've got slavery is wrong. It's wrong to kill people for personal gain, show and treat others with respect. We should be tolerant of others. When you get older, you should marry a member of the opposite sex and have kids. I mean, I think that's non-relative in the sense that that's probably a bad thing to enforce on people. Women with children shouldn't hold a job. Again, that's a sort of bad thing. It's non-relative in the sense that I think it's false and something that that you can't appeal to tradition to justify, and you need to give a better argument for, and I don't think there is one, so we can say it's false. Relative things, your culture might decide that it's wrong to eat dead people, and that's just what you do around here. Fine. Shake hands upon being introduced to someone. Fine, that's what you do around here. It's like driving on the right side of the road or the left side of the road. Adult incest is wrong. I mean, I can imagine, cultures just treating that as wrong. It's very natural to think that almost every culture would treat every case of incest as wrong. I've actually learned recently that there's a lot of cultures where, in the U.S., I think it's both, your primary family and your cousins and extended family. In other cultures, it doesn't count as incest if it's cousins. So again, if it's like a parent abusing a child, definitely wrong. But you could think of consensual sex between adults, relatives. If we treat that as wrong, it's the sort of thing that if at best it's just what we do around here, it's not something that has some sort of objective moral backing behind it. So, what is the underlying difference between the members of the first set and the second set that might explain what separates the relative from the non-relative? Well, if we look at the things on that first list of the non-relative things, it seems that they all have to do with respecting others' choices and autonomy, about promoting or harming people's well-being, and about equality and fairness, right? And that seems to be the sort of thing that we treat as not culturally relative, that these are acultural, universal values, which aren't just universal human values like, oh, all humans happen to adopt them. Lots of humans do not adopt equality and fairness and don't care about harming others. The way that they're universal is that we think that it's just true. It's a fact about the universe, that it is a truth, just like the speed of light, that the tides are caused by gravity, that these things are objectively valuable and important to respect and not violate. And that gives us the list of things that we tend to think are not relative. That's like, for example, slavery being wrong. And then the things the sort of stuff about two spaces after a period, driving on the right side of the road, how we dispose of our dead, whether we bury them, burn them, or eat them, which choice we make doesn't seem to have a right answer when we think about what respects others' choices and what promotes or harms people's well-being or matters of equality and fairness. Any answer is fine And so when a culture adopts a particular answer, it's perfectly fine for them to say, well, that's just what we do around here, because there isn't an answer that's enforced upon us by the objective value of respecting choices, respecting other people's welfare, matters of equality and fairness. And of course, I won't go through these again, but of course you've got Kantian deontology, which really pushes the idea that where it all really comes down to is the respecting others' autonomy and choices. The utilitarian says of these objective values, really, it comes down to harming people's well-being and promoting happiness and doing it in an equal way that does not treat anyone's happiness as mattering more than anyone else's. So that's the sort of reasons why a Kantian or a utilitarian, they can appeal to these objective values to say why slavery is wrong and why it's wrong to kill people for personal gain, regardless of what culture you belong to. But, it's wrong to eat dead people and it's gross. It's not I don't see how a Kantian or utilitarian would be able to justify that. And there's no way I don't see to justify that by appeal to these universal objective values. So that's the sort of thing that should just be treated as culturally relative, as something that's only justified by saying, well, it's what we do around here. If you want to stick to our tradition and fit in, you should follow our tradition. Or if you want to, if you just enjoy being a part of a tradition. I mean, there's lots of cultures where there's all sorts of values and ways of life and traditions that you want to keep up and commit yourself to belong to that culture and upkeep the values of that culture, but you can still do so while recognizing that it's just arbitrary and social convention, and it's not something that you should be able to enforce on anyone else, and no one's wrong for practicing doing something different than you. Okay, so a couple of reasons for, again, I've talked about this before. Philosophers are pretty evenly split between these three sorts of views of ethics: Kantian deontology, utilitarian consequentialism, and virtue ethics as sort of objective, absolutist moral theories, which are attempting to give arguments for why there is a right answer as to what's right and wrong for some things, and that they're non-objective, that they're not relative, and that cultures that don't respect them and don't follow these, what one of these moral theories says is just objectively wrong. So all three of these are going to rule out slavery. Actually, how about this? They all rule out slavery in the American South in 1850, just to take a concrete example, as being wrong. And it doesn't matter that the American South in the 1850s approved of slavery and it was a part of their culture, and they didn't have a problem with it. Fuck them. They're wrong. And the North was perfectly right to go kill as many people in the South as they needed to in order to overthrow that process and liberate those slaves. So in that case, there is an objective moral answer, and one that calls out for good moral people to step in and stop a bad practice. If the North did that, invaded the South because the South were eating their dead as their burial practice, to just enforce that perfectly relative practice that there is no morally objective right answer for, that would be wrong. There's plenty of Western explorers from Europe who were just freaked out by the fact that native women didn't, conceal their tops, right? They were topless, and thought that was just unchaste and a terrible practice, and thought that they needed to go to those natives and teach them about chastity and to cover up their women's breasts, because that is just sexually promiscuous. I don't know, but that's the sort of thing that you would say, no, you're wrong, because you're treating something that is just a relative cultural practice as if it was absolute. And once we know that, just going back here, that the sort of things that can justify a practice absolutely, like appeal to autonomy and choice, equality, fairness, and the harm or increase in well-being to people, like that's when we realize that that's the objective sort of values which these different moral theories are trying to sort out and give the exact right details to. But in abstract, those three values or those sorts of values are the absolutist ones. Any sort of war or intervention or attempt to change other people's ways of life that doesn't appeal to these and doesn't give a damn good justification for why it's so terrible that we have to intervene would be intolerant of us and wrong and presumptuous. really you should probably not intervene in other cultures unless it is really a reprehensible, terrible practice. And you should assume that maybe you don't exactly know, even if it's an absolute matter, you might think, well, maybe I'm wrong, maybe they're right. There is a right answer, but I shouldn't be so presumptuous to think that I have it right. Or maybe there's some societal, cultural nuance or complication that I don't know about, with the Eskimos and infanticide. So I think the point being here is that we can accept that some things are absolute and then accept that some things are relative. And then when we do that, it allows us to sort them into what's relative and what's not. And that's an important thing to know when is intervention right and called for, and when is it not, and when am I just being presumptuous and enforcing my culture on other people when there's no good reason for why they're for enforcing my culture as opposed to accepting theirs, because it's just a relative matter. And on top of that, I think there's good reason to just, in general, not to intervene in other cultures, even if it seems like it's an absolute matter, even if it seems like they're wrong, because interventions cost lives, and it presumes that you're the one who's right. Like if there's some group of people who think that the earth is flat, I think they're idiots. There's a right answer. It's a right answer that they're wrong. I'm not going to spend my time trying to go correct them. Like, whatever, they can believe what they want. They have the right to be wrong. It'd be wrong for me, I think, to go intervene and brainwash them or force them to think that the earth is spherical. Like, they can believe whatever they want. It's a little different if it's slavery, right? Like, that's the sort of thing that not only is there an absolute true answer, but it's the sort of thing that leads to real moral harm being done to people, the slaves, and intervening on their behalf is something worth doing and morally justified. Okay, so let's talk about reasons for moral relativism. We can no longer say that the customs of other societies are morally inferior to our own. The moral relativist thinks that that's a good thing, because it means that we're being more tolerant and we're not like going around judging other societies. That's good for relative matters when we're talking about whether women should wear tops and not bare their breasts, because that's the sort of thing we shouldn't be going around judging other societies for. That's a relative matter. Or their burial practice, that's a relative matter. Why this is a problematic reason for as a justification for moral relativism is that it also means I can't intervene in the American South to stop slavery, or to fight the Nazis in their genocide of Jews and gypsies and the disabled and gays. Another reason for moral relativism is people often confuse it for moral skepticism. I mean, there's a position you could take, which is all morality is bullshit. There is no true answers about what you should or shouldn't do. Utilitarianism is wrong. Kantian ethics is wrong. Virtue ethics is wrong. There is no answer. I find that position, that's a respected position in philosophy. There's plenty of philosophers who argue for it. There's not as many who argue for moral relativism, but what we call moral nihilism, moral error theory, moral skepticism, the position that ethics is just false and there is no true ethics. That's a position that a lot of philosophers hold. And I think a lot of times people are moral relativists because they're trying to be moral skeptics, which is a different position. They're trying to say all of ethics is wrong, and they end up saying the different thing, which is that moral relativism is true. I would push you, if you're tempted by moral relativism, to think seriously about, is it what I believe that there are true answers to ethics and they depend on my society? Or is what I believe is that just ethics is bullshit entirely? That's a different position. And I think if you think of yourself as a moral relativist, you probably are really attracted to this other position, that ethics is just bullshit and false. Not that it's true, but relative to culture. Another is the supposed widespread disagreement between societies over morality. Often arguments for moral relativism are made on the grounds that different cultures have these radically different beliefs about morally true answers, and that shows that morality must not have a absolute answer because cultures differ so much on their answers about what's true in morality. I think in response to this, there is a lot of widespread agreement. Murdering people for your own self-benefit is something that's cross-cultural. Rape in general, cross-culturally wrong, right? There's lots of things that cultures differ on, like burial practices, maybe about, and there is this sort of disagreement between the American South and North in the 1850s about slavery. But for the most part, like, there is widespread agreement about things, about the wrongness of murder, rape, lying just to get something you want, stealing just to get something you want, slavery. Took a little while, but people got on the same page. So I put here the supposed widespread. I don't think there is all that much widespread. There's a lot of things we disagree about, but they're either really difficult matters to get right, like abortion. Why is there disagreement across cultures about abortion? Because it's just a really difficult philosophical issue to settle what the right answer is. And other things that societies disagree about are sort of relative things that we shouldn't think of as being a part of morality anyway, like burial practices. And also another reason for moral relativism is who's to say we're right about morality and they're wrong? Fair point. Who's to say I'm right about the speed of light or that the earth is spherical or flat? But I think one of us is right and one of us is wrong. And maybe I should be humble and realize that maybe I'm not the one who's right. It doesn't mean I have to be a relativist and say there is no right answer, that the right answer is one thing for me and something different for them. I can say, no, there is a right answer about whether the earth is flat or spherical, and it's the same for both of us. One of us is wrong. Maybe I should be humble and realize that maybe I'm the one who's wrong, but I shouldn't accept that actually we're both right, because whatever is right depends on what we believe as opposed to the shape of the earth. So a couple of reasons against moral relativism. We could no longer say that the customs of other societies are morally inferior to our own. I think we should be able to say that, and it's true to say that about the American South in the 1850s, about their horrific practice of slavery. I think we can say that about in 1950s America, in the way that they had an apartheid state, with the way they treated African Americans as subpar people. That was a society that is inferior to ours in that it did not respect the equality and equal humanity and personhood and rights and choices of a part of their populace for stupid reasons. So I do think we should realize something about how we should withhold judgment about other cultures, about their burial practices. And maybe we should be a little humble and think, well, maybe we're wrong and they're right, even if it is an absolute matter. But it is, I think, an important thing that we do stand up and say that slavery is wrong, even if it's a cherished practice of a different culture, and they're wrong to practice it. And maybe we should say the same thing about female circumcision, female genital mutilation of children. We could decide whether actions are right or wrong just by consulting this. I mean, if moral relativism was true, how do you know whether slavery is right or wrong? It depends on what your culture believes. So all you need to do is look up what your culture approves of and what it doesn't approve of. So there's no the right and wrong answer is just, according to the moral relativists, automatically and indisputably determined by whatever the hell your society happens to pick. That seems wrong, right? It seems like I could belong to 1850s South, the American South, and live there. And even though the society and culture approves of slavery, and I know that, I haven't actually settled whether slavery is right or wrong. And in fact, I can argue that it's not right and appeal to things other than the standards of the society I'm living in. It would undermine the idea of moral progress if we were moral relativists, because it would say, basically, moral standards are like clothing fashions. Slavery used to be popular. Now it's not popular. Maybe it'll be popular again later. So it used to be right. Now it's wrong, but it might be right again later. That doesn't seem correct. We've made progress from the American South at the 1850s by realizing that slavery is wrong. If we go back to having a populace as slaves, then we have morally degressed and gotten worse. So I think that there is sense to be able to talk about how a culture or society has improved morally compared to other times or gotten worse, whereas moral relativism isn't going to be able to say that. And then, of course, if you're a moral relativist, there's this question of which of the many groups I belong to determines how I should live. They're trying to say it's relative to my culture, my society, but I belong to a family which has its own traditions, which might differ from the traditions of my friends, which might differ from the traditions of my state and my state's culture. I grew up in Texas. Texas is a very unique culture, which might differ from general America. I mean, I belong to all of these groups. So the moral relativist says, well, morality is relative to your culture. And then it's like, well, I belong to a lot of societies and cultures. There's an issue here, maybe not an insurmountable issue, but there is an issue about determining what the relativist owes us an explanation as to which culture or societal level that right and wrong gets determined by according to their moral theory. And lastly, appeal to the most plausible proposals for non-relativist morality and argument. So another reason against moral relativism is that we have already looked at very good arguments for utilitarianism, for Kantian ethics, for virtue ethics. We've provided one argument against moral relativism is just to look at the alternative, which are these other moral theories, and the arguments for them. And if those arguments work, then they must be right and moral relativism might be wrong. So I think another argument against moral relativism is the arguments for some non-relative theory like utilitarianism, Kantian ethics, or virtue ethics. Just to end with another example from the readings. So King Darius, he brought these two groups to his court to talk with them about burial practices. He offered one group, I think the Greeks, how much money would I have to pay you to eat your dead instead of bury them? And they were just like, no amount of money. You could never get me to be this immoral monster and eat a dead person because it's cannibalism and disrespectful of the dead, et cetera, et cetera. And then he asks the Colossians, whose practice is to eat their dead, like that's their burial practice. And he asks them, how much money could I have to pay you to get you to bury your dead instead of eat them? They're like, no amount of money. I would never do that. That's such an immoral, horrific thing to do because you have to eat them to show respect for the dead. And King Darius's point here is that that these sorts of moral commands are relative, and that sort of morality is relative, and that there are people who believe that something is ultra important to being a good person, and then there's another culture who thinks the exact opposite thing is required by morality and to be a good person. And to the extent that King Darius is making a point about burial practices, I think he's absolutely right. That is culturally relative. I just think that that's not a good example to disprove absolute morality, objective morality, because objective morality is about not murdering people, not going to my neighbor's house, killing them and taking their money just for their money, or raping somebody, or slavery. Like that is a bad example for trying to prove moral relativism is true, because it doesn't pick the things that seem like are actually not relative, which are a different set of commands. Burial practices, sure, those vary. The right answer just differs from culture to culture, just like what side of the street to drive on. But I think King Darius was wrong to think that that is what morality is about in the first place. Okay, well, that's the lecture on moral relativism.